Hello and welcome to Stampscaping 101. This is a scene that I did for Scrap and Stamp magazine. I did another scene as my main step-by-step scene, but just to do another scene for variation. In the magazine article, I created this one right here. It was nice and bold, dark, and kind of more simple than the other scene, which is this one. Okay, I thought this would make a nice accompanying scene for this one, which is a little bit more, I guess, involved. Making a nice graphic statement, just using a few stamps in this scene and having kind of a simple color scheme I thought would be nice for the article. But anyways, the main, I guess, idea of this scene when I went into it, I was just thinking about having a nice soft light being cast on a couple trees, which, for me kind of act as almost columns to frame the composition off. And for me, it's just kind of about that soft light on a kind of a lone form back there, which is the eagle. I put some white pigment ink on the wings there to kind of soften them up a little bit on the side of the wings that were facing the moon. And that's the same thing that's going on these tree trunks here. On the inner side of the tree trunk, I've placed a little bit of the pigment ink to just kind of soften it up over here in that moonlight. Reeds and smaller reeds in the background, and just to kind of break up the monotony of these two very powerful vertical shapes, what I've used is the overhanging branch, which is the oak branch, and I just used that portion of it like that. Okay, and just to balance it off, I put another one on this side, just using a tiny portion of it right over here. But anyways, it was kind of a fun scene to do. I'd like to do light sources, and I like putting something in front of them just to create that contrast in terms of value, lights and darks, and also creating a sense of near and far by having that in there. So, and it just makes it all that more dramatic by having those play off each other, a light source and something kind of blocking it a little bit, not covering it up completely, but just kind of going into it. And the moons are always a great opportunity for doing something like that. So anyways, thanks again for tuning in, and if you watch the video, I hope you enjoy it. Okay, let's try to make a simple but dramatic visual statement, simple in terms of compositional arrangement, and dramatic in just how these elements are used, okay? We're going with the moon right here, and I really want this to look like there's a kind of a glowing illumination about it. So what I'm doing is I've inked up the stamp using a Memento Bahama blue. It's a medium value blue. You can use a darker one. You can use a lighter one too. I'm going with the medium, and then where I'm wiping off the ink, hopefully that will stamp out lighter so we can get a range of values within the impression. I want the light in this impression to be kind of a softer light, and that's why I've wiped off a lot of the ink. Okay. Now this stamp is called Hot Sun, but if you stamp it in blue, it just becomes a moon. Okay. So you can see where it's stamped out a little bit darker in the edges, and right in the center, around the moon, it's lighter. So to me, it looks like it's kind of we have cast light. Okay, now, let's see. I'll tell you what, let's use this same blue, and we'll use the Cloud Cumulus stamp. The way the stamp is used, I usually have the billowing area where they're lighter, kind of facing the moon. So if I'm doing it here, I would have this cloud facing that way, and if I stamp it around here, you know, I'm going to turn and rotate this cloud accordingly, okay? Now, around this edge right here, the top surface, I'm going to take a dry paper towel and wipe off a lot of the ink so that when I stamp it out, I won't get a harsh line right here because this area in here is fairly light. So, let's wipe it off on that side so we get a seamless blend of that cloud texture going into that hot sun, in this case moon, impression. Okay. Now, every time I re-ink this, I feel that it's a good idea to do before I make the impression, because if I take this and I stamp it out here, all the ink has been removed in this area, but in this little area out here where it's stamped out there, it came off the stamp at a different rate because, you know, you're stamping it one side into glossy and one side into this matte paper, or maybe some array doesn't stamp, you know, make an impression at all. And if I go for a second impression of it and stamp it out, it's probably going to be all kind of, there's going to be lines showing within the impression. So get a fresh inking of your dye-based ink and make your impression and get a good, smooth, even impression of that shape or image. Okay. Now I'm kind of being, you know, somewhat careful about not taking this cloud and just completely obliterating, you know, and stamping over my moon. So I'm probably going into that previous impression about 1/4 to 1/2 inch or so. Okay. Re-ink. Now, around on the perimeter of this card, it's going to get fairly dark in that area, so I'm not worried about, you know, wiping this off so much. Okay? What I do when I make my impressions with a stamp, I usually have a center pressure like that, as opposed to pressing down on the sides, and make sure you don't rock the image, because we don't want to get, you know, real heavy edges like that around on the edges, because when you go on with your next impression, it'll look really blocky, okay? So most of the pressure in the center like this, so that these edges don't become overly harsh. Okay. It could have been open sky up there as well, and just put some, you know, a bank of clouds down here, and it could have been just, you know, wide open sky up there as well, you know, so you can do it however you want. It could have been a bank of clouds going diagonal like this, you know, maybe for a little bit more visual movement, you know, having a slanted composition that might have been looked nice too. Or you could do it, you know, a bank of clouds right here and a bank of clouds right here, and where there's a strip, you know, kind of in the center, you know, that could have been open sky in there as well. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can use your background stamps in terms of the cloud usage. Okay, let's make that cloud, or, well, I guess clouds, but also the moon, stand out a little bit more. Let's make that the source of light. Right now, it's a very light area, but we also have these clouds in the area, you know, underneath it, sides and above, of an equal value, meaning white. So in order to make that stand out lighter, you have to make the area around it darker. Okay? Let's go with a range of blues. Here's some Memento, light, medium, and dark blue. This is how I generally approach colors. I have light, mediums, and darks. If you have various shades of something, you can also, you know, introduce those into the mix. If you want a warmer blue, you can introduce something like a turquoise blue into this, your range of colors that you're working with. And don't be afraid to mix colors too, go with blues and add a pink or something like that into it. Okay, now before I go into it with this light blue, I think I want to get a good amount of coverage with an even lighter blue. This is a shadow stamping ink. It's a very light value of blue. This one's called Seashells Ocean Aqua. It's also called Adirondack Lights Aqua. Alright, if you don't have something like that, just go with whatever your lightest color is that you happen to have in the, in a whatever hue you happen to be working in, okay? My preference is to not go too dark, though. If you don't have a really light value of a given color, say if you want to go with a light orange or something like that, if you have a light blue, light yellow and a pink or something like that, you can blend those over one another, and pink and yellow will mix to, or visually layer to appear orange. Or if you want to go with a green, if you happen to have a light blue and a light yellow, layer those over one another and it look kind of greenish, okay? They're not physically blending, like you're not mixing two inks together, but dye-based inks are transparent, so let's say I put a blue down here. If I put a yellow over it, it's not going to look like just straight yellow. It's going to look more green because you're going to be seeing the blues through the yellow, placed on top of it. Okay, controlling light through the use of dark or value. If you want certain clouds to remain nice and light, like they're reflecting some of that moonlight, just simply don't tone everything out, okay? Not that that would be wrong, but if that's what you're going for, just, do what I call selective coloring, alright? Don't do everything. Okay, that's enough of the aqua. Now we're going on with the Memento Summer Sky. It's not too much darker. I don't seem to be getting very much of a change in value here. No big deal. Just switch out from the Summer Sky, move up into your next value. Okay, here comes the Bahama Blue, the same color that I stamped, made the impressions of my cloud and sun with, or in this case a moon. Work from the outside in. And again, a selective method of color application. If you want that cloud to remain light, stay away from it. Okay? So the most coloring that I generally do in terms of my shading process, it's usually with the first color. That's usually the one that I use the most, because in a lot of my scenes, or most of them, there's some form of, light source. I want to have a range of values, and the light source doesn't have to be anything as formal as an object like a moon or a sun. It could just be an area that's a little bit lighter than other areas. But generally, my lighter tones get closer to those areas or objects, and then when I move them to my darker tones, the darker tones tend to be a little bit more perimeter oriented, okay? So, that being said, let's move on to my darker tone, Memento Blue. Start at the corners like that. You get a good feel of what that color is going to look like over other colors, over other values. And you can see it kind of incrementally gets a little bit darker with each increasingly darker value of that hue. Okay. The darker I take the perimeter, the lighter that seems by contrast my light source. Okay. And of course the darkest color that you can use in dye-based inks would be black. All blacks are not created equal. Some of them are more of a gray tone in comparison with others. Don't be afraid to use more than one. If one is lighter than the other, you can use the lighter one first before you move into the darker one, if you happen to have it. Okay, let's see. Let's try this blue. It's a Marvy blue. I think it's a Prussian blue. And Prussian blue happens to be a very dark blue. If you're familiar with the Ranger Adirondack line of blues, there's a denim blue that's very, very dark. And I don't know, I always like having a range of blues. I basically buy every blue out there, unless it's so close to a blue from another brand, but I don't know, in nature stamping you tend to utilize a lot of blue tones for various purposes, so it's always good having ones that can increase your range of values or a particular, say, temperature of blue, meaning kind of aqua blues or turquoise blues. You can call it turquoise greens too. Okay, that was the blue, and let's see, the sticker has been placed over it. It was used in some magazine spread, I think, so I'm not quite sure which one that was. It was either Prussian or this is bottle green. The casing was so dark I thought that was black, but no big deal. Let's go on to the black. Okay, and I'm tipping my edges is what I call it. That green added a little bit of warmth, which doesn't look bad up in that corner right there. Sometimes you add kind of a greenish blue, or a greenish tinge, and into an otherwise blue composition, and you've kind of introduced kind of a new temperature, which increases the temperature range of a given visual. So I like to have a value range in terms of light and dark, but sometimes you can tweak the temperature too and introduce that into the mix. It's like the language of color: intensity, hue, and value. Okay, going into the corner right here. I want to get that corners. I like my corners really dark, especially in nighttime scenes. Okay. Getting darker and darker. Again, darker on the corners, lighter in the middle. Relatively speaking, it's not physically getting lighter, it just seems lighter by contrast. Alright. Let's move on to, let's see, I was thinking about adding some trees here. I want something to frame off this scene in a nice bold fashion. Okay. So what I think I'm going to do is I think I'm going to add these tree trunks to kind of frame the composition. It's going to look too symmetrical though. So what I'll do is I'll add these tree trunks to the composition, and then we'll introduce something else into the mix, just so it doesn't look so evenly weighted. Okay. Now I want this tree trunk to be really, really dark. So I'm making sure that I re-inked my black pad a couple hours ago, and I think that should do the trick. There's a lot of surface area on this design. I'm going to have that top of the tree trunk going off the top of the page just so I don't have to stamp something here and address the top, you know, where it kind of ends abruptly. Okay. And I'm framing off that scene, and you'll see why after I stamp these out, or I get a little farther along in the composition. Okay. Now I'm stamping kind of wet into wet. The page right here is not, you know, sopping wet or anything like that, but it's going to be damp from all the ink that we've used on the scene in that layering process. So what I recommend is if you're going on the surface, you know, over the top of all of that coloring, to just kind of keep your stamp, you know, application going a little bit longer than you normally would. You know, just so that ink transfers over to the card. Okay. Now this one here, why don't we stamp it off, you know, a little bit higher, just so it's not so symmetrical, like you know, fence posts or something like that. Maybe I'll have this one going off the page a little bit more too. And I mean, you can also lean it one way or another too if you want to. Okay, I'll go about, I'm guessing it's going to be, it's about 1/8 of an inch higher, 1/8 to 1/4 inch higher maybe. Okay, plenty of pressure over the whole thing. Don't rock it, okay? We don't want the edges to get all smeared. Okay, and just hold it down, let the ink transfer. I think it's ready to go though, but just to be safe. I don't want to pull this up and suddenly it's like really gray and everything's just showing right through it, and then I have to get a stamp positioner or something like that and re-stamp it. Nothing against stamp positioners, but you know, if I can get through something without having to use it, then I will. Okay. These end right down here. Let's go in, and I'm going to add a little bit of this Sedge filler stamp. Okay, I'm going to give these trees something to stand on. Okay, in terms of some texture. This card is really, really juicy wet right now. In these corners right here, especially where the ink, the black ink of the, you know, the tree trunk image has been stamped out, and there's tiny little puddling, you know, of there's a tiny little puddling of ink in those areas, meaning that if I'm going to go over this, I'm going to add some more tone to these trees, but let's wait till this dries a little bit before we do that. Okay, here's some reeds. This is the Reeds large stamp, and like I said, let's kind of break up the too symmetrical of composition with some additional tone. What I'm doing is with each impression, I'm kind of changing the angle a bit. Okay. How about some more out this way? Having these kind of grass blades like this, they all kind of point up into the sky in this direction, kind of at our focal point right now, which is the moon. Alright, let's see. I think we could use something coming in from the edge, maybe. That might be kind of nice. I tell you what, we have some reeds in the foreground in both areas. We have our little sedge cluster, which is kind of like, represents kind of a little chunk of grass going back into the distance because there's larger textures, and it goes into a smaller texture in the background. But that being said, if there's a little bit of depth in that stamp, I mean, we can stamp it up like this, you know, on top of one another, and it won't look like wrong if you do it that way. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take and I'm going to mask off this tree trunk here, and let's use the smaller reed stamp, okay? And what we'll do is we'll create some additional textures, maybe on one side of the scene, just for a little bit of variation, okay, from one side of the card to the next. Okay, see that there? Okay, so having that little tuft of grass is kind of nice, where there isn't one there, at least in the behind the tree trunk. And let's add a little bit more on that little space back there. There's just a tiny little area for it. Okay. Put a little bit more grass back in that area. Okay. I like this area to have a little bit of warmth. I know moonlight, everything's under a cool light, but I think having a little bit of green down here will differentiate the sky from land. So we'll do that when the time comes. Alright, now let's get into the subject of the scene. I was going to have a nice dramatic eagle flying at night. Okay, I guess it would be coming in from this, let's see, coming in from this side, something like that. Okay, something fairly close to the eye. This is a block treated with Tekken peel. Your unmounted stamps stick right to it for a temporary mounting system. Okay, it's ready to go. This is a real strong, bold silhouette. Let's test it right here, and let's make sure that we want that. What angle do we want it at? I think kind of swooping in to the scene from underneath might look interesting. Like this. So maybe I'll have the head kind of right in front of the moon. You know how making your edges a little bit darker makes the... Okay, just ran out of camera battery there, but what I was saying was creating contrast with the use of the darker edges around the on the corners of the card. If you put something really dark next to your light source, then that's another way to make your moon seem lighter by contrast, okay? You put that dark shape next to that, and that really pops out the background, okay? Or the lightness of the background, or of the object, okay? Right off with the tack and peel. Alright, now, let's see. I think I want to wait a little bit. This area right here, I don't know, I'm trying to catch that glare so you can see it, but that little area down there is wet with ink right now. I think a bit of browns or something on these tree trunks would look really good too, so we'll go in and do that when we come back, but we'll let the scene set up in terms of drying for a little bit before we go in and do that, because when we apply some more additional colors into these areas, what we don't want is we don't want to smear the impressions, okay? Now, the reason why I didn't stamp, color these areas first before I stamped the impressions is just simply because I didn't know where those trees were going to go, and I didn't, I wouldn't have known how far to, that I was going to stamp the sedge filler, so sometimes it's background and foreground, or background, coloring, then foreground, then more coloring. There's no set A to Z formula. You can always go back and add more color later if you want to. Or you could do the whole composition. I could have stamped out these trees first and just did all of my coloring afterwards. But sometimes I want to get a feel for the background, before I know where to place my objects. And sometimes I just want to do the background first and not worry about all these compositional elements. So I'll just do all the coloring and then just stamp out my objects over the top of it in black. So all kinds of different ways to work. But let's wait for this to dry, and we'll come back to it and finish it up. Okay, we're back. I've allowed this card to dry completely, as far as, especially on the black areas where I'm overlapping a lot of the layered tone that was applied with the sponging technique, and it's completely safe to go over without worrying about the smudging or smearing of little tiny puddles of ink. Okay, now I think what I want to do is I want to introduce some additional temperature into the scene. It's completely blue and cool tones right now, but down here in the kind of the base of the trees, the grassy area, I want to introduce some temperature, and what I like to do is build up some temperature gradually with some pale tones of green. Okay, and I start off with somewhat of a dull green because I don't want to take a chance of adding too much of anything at this point in time. I want to get a feel for what this is going to look like over my card. Just a little bit of temperature can make a big visual difference because you have basically a field of cool tone right now. So, it's a big temperature contrast when you introduce any type of warmth to a given area. So here we go with a little bit of, this is a pale green. This is what it looks like just on a white piece of paper. And I've applied some down here. You can see some being applied up here in the tray, just to change that temperature a little bit. I really can potentially bring an area to life. It wouldn't show up quite as much if you had a lot of warm tones in the background, okay? But just through this contrasting temperature, it can stand out quite a bit. Okay, I think that's about enough of that green tone down there. Now let's go into the tree area, and I'm thinking about some warm tones. Let's add a little bit of peach Bellini, in terms of that's the seashells or Adirondack Lights tone. It's a very pale, warm version of kind of a tan, warm tan color, but very pale. Okay, and I like to add common tones over different areas just to give the scene a little bit of continuity. In other words, I put that green up in the tree, which already had some blue from the background, instead of just having those as completely different colors. I want things to blend in with one another and kind of in a I don't know, a color harmony, I guess you can say, or call it. Okay, let's go in with the brown. Now this brown is pretty warm. It's medium tone brown, okay? Alright, adding some of the base here. This is altering the hue. Now, when you introduce this new color, the colors underneath are still going to affect what you see overall, even though you're applying another tone over the top of it, because these dye-based inks are transparent as opposed to opaque. Okay, so the colors underneath are always going to affect what you see overall, okay? Unless you're going with something like a black that's really dark black over, you know, a background, then it can possibly kind of eradicate, you know, or make invisible what you have underneath it, but that would be the only kind of real situation in terms of using dye-based inks. Okay, that's the brown there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these trees in space a little bit more. So let's go in and introduce a dark brown. Could be any dark brown, any type of dye-based ink. Pick a dark brown, doesn't have to be this one, okay? This is a Marvy one. Okay, now what I'm going to do is the light scheme is coming from the interior, the middle of the card, and what I want to do is introduce kind of some shading on the outer sides of the two tree trunks, but I'll do it on the opposite side from that light source, okay? So apply it there, and on this side of the tree, or on this side of the card, I'll do it on this side of the tree, okay? So on the left side of the card, we have the left side of the tree darkened. And on the right side of the card, the right side of the trunk. Applying some down here in the grass as well. You know, like I brought some of the green up in the tree, I'll bring some of the brown down at the grass. It doesn't read as kind of straight brown, it's just kind of darkening that area. Okay, a little bit more bold. Now I'm looking at this in terms of symmetry, okay? It's still looking, even though I have a little bit more of a heavier read image right here, by and large it's kind of monotonous looking at it. It's too, it looks like Roman columns or something like that, okay, to me. And you have this eagle in the background, but the variation is just too static. So let's go up and break up some of these vertical lines right here with some form, okay? And we'll do that with the vehicle of, visual vehicle of foreground. Alright, let's go with the oak branch stamp. Let's go ahead and re-ink this. I want to make sure that I get a really nice, solid, dark impression out of it. If you really want to kind of add some additional dimension, one of the things that might be kind of an interesting idea is to do this in embossed black. Use a detailed embossing powder or something like that, and then you can actually have a raised impression. Okay, let's see here. You can use any side of this branch right here, or different parts. One side's a little bit more heavy, and this side right here, it's a little bit lighter, okay? So you can be able to see more of the background coming through. I'm thinking about having this coming in from this side like this. I think this looks pretty good over the top. And maybe I'll put a little bit over that moon. Get nice even pressure right here. Allow the ink to transfer to the paper. Okay, that should be good. Alright. Now, that branch coming in from that side looks okay, but now I feel the visual weight of it is a little bit off. So what I'll do is I'll just take this and let me see if I can get that flare out of there. Okay, yeah, it's a little bit too dark. I have my light. One of the things about working with glossy paper, I get that glare on these cards when I'm working on them. Sorry about that. Okay, but what I don't like is just that having that shape or that texture just on one side, but let's just use a little bit of it on the other side, but let's not put it up here. Let's put a little bit of it creeping into the scene from the edge, and I'll just use this little bit right here. Okay, and let's see what we have here. Okay, so just that little bit kind of coming in from the side like that. Okay. And I think that looks good as far as the stamping portion of this composition goes. Can't think of anything else that I really want in there. So let's move into some pigment ink and adding in some soft textures and lighting into the scene. Now, as I say this, what I'm thinking about is I need to watch out for these tree limbs here. You know, just like I waited for these areas to dry down here, I need to wait for that to dry because I don't want to dab in some pigment ink in here and start to blur that nice, crisp, dark, black branch. Okay, so let me add this texture and lighting down here. Let me see. Let me grab this blotter paper here again that already has some impressions on here just to give you an idea of how much ink is being used. If you go into this pad right here, okay, and this pad is fairly wet with ink, okay, it'll apply a ton of, like a blob of ink right there, but that's not what you want. What you want to do is you want to take off a lot of ink. If your pad is really wet, don't ink it as much as I just did, okay, just kind of lightly dab into it, and then you won't have to remove so much ink if you don't put so much on to begin with. But what you want is kind of a fairly dry and smashed tip on your swab, okay? It's almost where when you start applying it to your card and to various areas in the card, a light tapping almost doesn't apply very much ink at all. Now I still have quite a bit on here, so I'm going to take off a little bit more just so it applies in a much more gradual application. Okay, now what I've done right here, you can see on that eagle wing, is I've dabbed a little bit of ink in there, so it's kind of lightened that area. Now in here too, you see that where that doesn't have like a really solid black. If I spray this with the spray sealant, that should just darken right up in there, so I'm not worried about that. But watch right over here. You see the difference between this wing and this wing right here? Let me put a little bit of ink along that side, that ridge of that design, and let's see if it'll appear as though some light is hitting, some of that soft light is hitting that wing, thus giving it a little bit more of a three-dimensional feel. If you have kind of one area of it lit, you're saying that there's kind of a roundness to, or a three-dimensional aspect to that image. Okay. Okay, so there you have that. It's kind of just a little bit of a different look. Alright, I'm thinking back here, how about on that little tail? Let's put a little bit of a tone on the back of that tail. Maybe it's some light is hitting that. Okay, you see where it's just a very little amount. And I'm tapping a lot, so it builds up things slowly onto that area, and you have a lot of control over it, okay? See that? Okay, now let's do the same thing on the tree trunk right here. Maybe where this tree trunk is being illuminated on the side, where it's facing the moon. I'm getting some of that moonlight. Maybe don't put it up the entire side, but you can do it on, you know, parts here and there. You know, in other words, you don't need to, you know, whiten, you know, lighten that whole area, but maybe just in a couple spots. If you ever add some of this ink where you don't like it, just kind of wipe it right off, dab it right off. Okay, how about this other tree on the other side? What you're doing too, I mean, this is lighting, but it's introducing texture into the scene. Okay, all areas a little bit lighter like that, so hopefully it looks like moonlight's hitting that tree. Okay, I kind of like it there, so let's try it with a little bit more. Okay, so you have that nice soft illumination. Okay, soft, billowy light. Looks good on the solid objects, but why don't we try it on the background clouds? Okay. If I've made those clouds too dark, okay, if I've laid color down over the top of it, sometimes that looks strange if you put white, soft tone onto them, because what this white soft tone kind of represents, it's kind of moisture in the air, and it's being hit or being illuminated and thus illuminated with white light. Okay, so you need to retain some of the white of the paper for this white pigment ink to kind of be effective as far as the appearance that you're going after. Now there's different colors of pigment ink too. Let's say this got really dark blue back here or something like that. Maybe you try a light blue pigment ink instead of white. Maybe that'll look good because it won't be have so much contrast between you know, the white pigment ink and the background. So, and if that being said, you can do this with, let's say you have a sunset scene or something like that where you're using yellows, oranges, reds, or something like that. You might try a yellow pigment ink as opposed to a white, especially if you've kind of toned out all the white of the paper, you know, in the coloring process. Okay, going into the moon. The moon already had some kind of a value change with the by simply wiping off some ink before the impression, but this is just going in and kind of reiterating that idea of kind of a soft illumination by adding in some additional pigment ink. Okay, now I'm going over that branch a little bit. I have to be careful that, make sure that branch is fairly dry right there. But going over some of that branch in the foreground too, it can kind of turn that object in space a little bit by having some of those branches illuminated by the light, by making them a little bit lighter. Let's not go over here into this area. I'm kind of worried that that might not be completely dry yet. Okay. I like that over these clouds though. This kind of this soft look down here by adding this little translucent soft application of ink, and kind of adding a more I don't know, what would the word be, kind of this illusion of, well, going back to that thing I was saying, is it's moisture in the air, okay? If you look at a cloud, it looks, from far a distance, it could, especially like a cumulus cloud, it can look very crisp, but if someone was flying a plane through it, you wouldn't see like crisp tufts of cloud. It would be more, it looks like vapor, where the edges are not defined as defined. Okay, and that's what this can kind of do. Alright. A little bit of a softer tone in this area. Okay. You can see that side of that tree. Okay. Now, if you want to, we can introduce a little bit of this to the, why don't we introduce a little bit of a, kind of a moonlit fog kind of developing on the forest floor. I don't want to take it in too far down here, okay, because it's in shadow, so you wouldn't really have this illumination of, suspended vapor in the air in a shadowed area. I guess if you put a little bit there, what you're saying is that moonlight is coming in and kind of creeping into this area, around the tree. Put a little down there just for some texture. You know how we brought in some color over different objects. We brought in some green into the tree and some brown into the grass. We have some blue going through the tree trunks and the forest floor. Well, we've introduced this texture into the scene in the sky. Now we can introduce some of this texture to the ground, and what that is doing is it's adding another kind of a layer of continuity into the scene. So what you're doing is we're kind of constantly in the process of blending our different imagery, trees, sky, animal, foreground, while those create different layers of depth within the scene. What you're doing is you're using color, texture in the forms of inks, darker inks and lighter inks here into the mix. So what we're doing is we're just constantly separating things in terms of distance, but we're combining things in terms of everything else colors and you know, the different types of inks, transparency and translucency. Okay, adding a little bit more fog down here. Like some fog is kind of coming into the scene. Alright. By the way, when I'm stamping all these things, I'm not thinking about all these. If I'm not making a video, I'm not thinking in my head, okay, let's separate this, and you know, it's kind of more visual. You know, you're just kind of it's more by feel. It's visual and feel. You know, it's like I'm just thinking, okay, does that, you know, something missing here a little bit, and you know, you can kind of go off more intuition or whatnot. You know, if it just feels like you've gone too far, go in and, you know, wipe off some of that pigment ink or something like that. You can't really remove dye-based ink, but you can remove the pigment ink off the top even after it dries if it looks kind of out of place. You know, if you've worked on the glossy card stock, you can go in and just buff it right out and it'll come right off even after it dries. Okay, now that's if I'm using color box pigment ink. If you're using something like a Brilliance pad or some of those faster drying pigment inks, you might not be able to do that. Okay, soft textures, translucent textures over the scene to bring light, continuity, and texture in the scene. Let's go add light over dark in terms of a crisp object in the form of these little highlights. Okay, I've retained the white of the card in the form of this moon and some areas down here in the clouds, so I can add in these little light white highlights. Okay, we have light source and reflected light. Okay, the reflected light is going to, you know, be the same color as the cast light. So I can do, you know, the white gel pen here. Okay, we can go in and this lighter area of the tree, add a few little highlights on, you know, the top surfaces of these areas right here. I guess in this is kind of like the side surface, but see this little area down here facing the light. Let's put a little highlight on that side of the tree. Just a fine little detail, but okay, looks like kind of light is hitting that side of the object. Okay, now where would you do it here? Would you do it on this side of the tree? No, we're going to do it on the side of the tree that's facing the light, okay? Just as we put shadow on the far side of the tree, we'll put the highlights on the near side, okay? And within the tree, there's some different forms, and I'll put the highlights again on the side of the form facing the light source. This is one of the things that when people first start doing this, I get a lot of comments that they don't know where to put these highlights, okay? It's real simple. If you have a light source right here, okay, and okay, be whatever it is, and then if you have some objects like that, let's imagine these are rocks, okay, you just put a few little highlights on the sides of the rocks facing the light. Now let's say we have a, you know, a tree trunk right over here or something, you know, you can put some highlights on the side of the tree right here. But let's say we have an overhanging, you know, palm frond or something like that, okay? Let's say this is a palm frond right here. Let's say this is our card right here, okay? On the palm frond, on this side of the palm frond, you can put a few little dots, okay? You don't outline the whole thing, okay? There's just a few little dots here and there, okay? Especially if you retain some of the white of the paper. Okay, so that's just a general idea. So let's take a look at the scene again. Okay, now we have the moonlight right here on the side of the tree, facing the moon. We have some highlights. Now what about on this branch right here? Well, we can put a few little highlights on the side of that branch facing the moon. In the darker areas, there's less highlights. Maybe as I move closer to that light source, maybe I put a few more highlights, okay? So you can see that branch right there. So it's just those few little, oops. Now see, if you don't like it, you just wipe it right off. This branch right here, I just put a few dots right there, and that really pulls it out from the background. And you can see those dots right here, okay, on the branch facing that moon. And it looks like right here, from a little bit of a distance, is, let me get that glare out of the way. See how that looks? The branch, instead of just disappearing in the background, which it kind of still does, but you kind of pull it out a little bit with the use of those dots. It's just a few, what is there, maybe a dozen dots or so. Same thing over here. Let's treat this branch right here that really gets lost and, you know, the shade of that, you know, that tree trunk. Let's pull that out a little bit with the use of some dots that represent highlights. Okay, so just those few little highlights. Okay. How about down here on the grass? There's kind of tufts of grass like this, you know, a little bit. Okay, now on the top surfaces of these tufts of grass like that, I'll add some highlights, okay? How that will look down here is like this. Okay, kind of brings that area to life a little bit. It's like dew on the grass or something like that, reflecting that that moonlight. Grassy areas back here, they stand out enough, but if you just want to put a little extra touch onto those areas to kind of add detailing, we have a lot of reeds down here that are really lost in that shade. Be careful in these areas because these little dots can really stand out. But like I said, if you've add too much, just, you know, take a paper towel and or Kleenex or whatever, take your finger and just wipe it right off, and it'll come off. Okay. But I'm just adding some highlights onto them, onto some of them like that. And let's see what that looks like from, you know, kind of arm's distance. Kind of pulls them out a little bit more, doesn't it? Okay, maybe a few more. Like that. Same thing on the opposite side. It's really a fun application or usage of your your gel pens to do this. Okay. Let's take a look here. It's kind of looking a little bit uniform down here. There's spacing is a little bit too symmetrical. Let's wipe some of this off like that. See that? That looks a little bit better. See, now we've increased our lighting scheme. We're not just set only with the lighting scheme as introduced with tones in the background on trees, but we've introduced lighting, a reiteration of lighting with the use of the color box pigment ink and the white gel pen. And look at all that texture that's kind of added in there, and kind of the detailing that results. One of those things that we learned in, back in art school was kind of want to have something that's effective, from a distance, like a poster or something like that. You want to have impact, okay? Just in general. But it's the things that can retain one's attention, that can really increase the, the range of interest in a given piece, something that people can look at on future viewings or repeated viewings that can kind of add that little extra touch, and I think that's where these little details come into play. And for me, that's the funnest part of these scenes, is adding in those little details. Okay, so anyways, I hope you enjoyed the scene, and as always, thanks for checking out the videos. I have to think of a good title for this one.